These are some of the craziest witch trials you may have never heard about. Most people have heard about the Salem witch trials, but there's a lot of other witch trials that happened long before and even during the Salem witch trials. This one takes place in Trier, Germany. This was one of the largest witch trials in European history. This enormous witch hunt took over 6 years, and they say it was politically motivated. Trying to prove himself, the newly appointed archbishop wanted to purge 3 groups: the Protestants, the Jewish, and the witch. Very few of those that were accused of witchcraft ever made it out alive. Hundreds of people from over 22 villages were captured during that time span. They were actually tortured, and of course they confessed under torture. Over a third of the people that were held and burned to death as witches were actually held in high esteem in the government. They were priests, judges, and all kinds of esteemed positions. Other forms of torture I cannot even say on this video.
Do you believe in witchcraft? This is one of the deadliest witch trials in the Scottish borders. In 1629, there was a mass trial in Peebles. In total, 27 men and women were accused of witchcraft. The church elders got together and were given a list of all 27 names. So they wrote to the council and asked permission to have a witch trial, although it was more of a witch hunt, really. By Christmas Eve, all 27 had been strangled to death. Remember, Scotland doesn't burn their witches.
If you can imagine the mass hysteria of the Salem witch trials taking place in 17th century France, you'd get the Affair of the Poisons. In 1675, this lady was arrested and executed for poisoning her father and brothers. Her trial captivated the people of France, who all of a sudden began to believe that every mysterious death was a poisoning. As a result, the authorities began to round up all these fortune tellers and alchemists that they thought were selling poison. The most notorious poison dealer of the bunch went by the name Lavoisin. Lavoisin implicated many of the people who worked for Louis XIV, but the most shocking accusations were about his mistress, Madame de Montespan. A lot of people already believed that she'd once poisoned a romantic rival. But now Lavoisin was claiming that Madame de Montespan had taken part in satanic rituals to win the king's love. Lavoisin also said that she and Madame de Montespan would sacrifice babies together, which the mistress would then feed to the king without his knowledge. 442 people were implicated and 36 were executed over a 5-year period, and that is just one part of the absolutely bonkers story that's the Affair of the Poisons.
There's a fine line between perfume and poison. For part 2 of this series, we're going to talk about the Affair of the Poisons, an inquiry and something of a witch hunt that rocked the court of King Louis XIV. A little backstory. To impress the king and the court, the nobility had to spend lavishly on clothes, carriages, and entertainments. And you're thinking, wait, weren't they rich? Yes, but that was on the backs of the French peasants who were increasingly unable to pay. Hello, French Revolution that was coming up in about 100 years. Also, with the amount of gambling and spending that was going on, they were burning through their money. This created another seedy underground like we talked about in the last video. With all the debauchery going on, there was an underground network of fortune tellers, astrologers, witches, and abortionists who were only too eager to step in and ride the desperation of these nobles. In 1676, a noblewoman, the Marquise de Brinvilliers, was convicted of poisoning her father and 2 brothers after testing her poisons on hospital patients and servants. Everyone was like, oh my god, how could a noble lady do something so heinous? What if she comes after the king and royal family? She was tortured by way of the water cure, and that was where you were forced to drink a ton of water until you confessed, and then she was beheaded. Her confession implicated a whole lot of other nobles, as well as practitioners of magic, witchcraft, and poison. This was the start of the Affair of the Poisons. Now let's talk about the 2 most famous people implicated. First, we have the king's former favorite mistress, Madame de Montespan. She had 7 children by way of Louis XIV, who were later legitimized. And she was so influential at court that she was known as the true queen. But things took a turn when the king's eye wandered to a 20-year-old ingenue, the Duchess du Fontaine. Madame de Montespan was so worried about her place at court that she sought out the services of La Voisin. Catherine Monvoisin was a fortune teller and apothecary who sold beauty products like perfume, creams, and lotions. She also dabbled in love potions, abortions, and poisons. Through her companion, Montespan secured love potions, aphrodisiacs, and even black masses to try to get the attention back from the king. When that failed, Montespan wanted the king and his new mistress dead. La Voisin was convinced to poison a petition that she was to give to the king. The plot was ultimately foiled, however, and the Affair of the Poisons was another one of those mass hysteria events. There were over 400 people implicated and 36 people were killed, including La Voisin, who was burned at the stake. The king was both humiliated, but also still loved Montespan because she got to live out her days in exile and was still invited to court functions. I created a perfume called the Affair of the Poisons, and naturally I added belladonna, but it's not real, so it won't kill you, don't worry. It's dark, sultry, and mysterious, and a perfect scent for October. Stay tuned for part 3 coming soon, where we'll dive into Madame Snake.
Accused of witchcraft, victims of Europe and United States murders. Over the 160 years, from 1500 to 1660, Europe saw between 50,000 and 80,000 suspected witches executed. About 80% of those killed were women. Execution rates varied greatly by country, from a high of about 26,000 in Germany to about 10,000 in France, 1,000 in England, and only 4 in Ireland. Despite all the mass numbers of people being accused of witchcraft killed in Europe, the United States still has the most world-famous Salem witch trials, which happened during the winter and spring of 1692 to 1693. When it was all over, 141 suspects, both men and women, were tried as witches. 19 were executed by hanging. 1 was pressed to death by heavy stones.
Germany was the classic land of witchcraft. In England, not more than 1,000 people were executed as witches. In Germany, at least 100,000 were executed. Torture was forbidden by English law. In Germany, the law ordered torture. 1 woman was tortured 56 times. In England, no witch was ever burned, alive or after strangling. In Germany, burning was the prescribed method of death. Contemporary chronicler wrote of Brunswick in 1590, the place of execution looked like a wood from the number of the stakes. A horrible spectacle met our eyes. Outside the walls of many towns and villages, we saw numerous stakes to which poor, wretched women were bound and burned as witches. An executioner in Silesia anticipated the Nazis of the 20th century. He constructed an oven in which one year, 1651, he roasted to death 42 women and young girls suspected of witchcraft. After 9 years, that number rose to 1,000.
I'm holding in my hand a copy of Malleus Maleficarum, or Hammer of the Witches. This copy is over 400 years old. Malleus Maleficarum was first printed in 1486, and it is the most sinister book ever written on witchcraft. It single-handedly brought about a witch-hunting craze that would start in Europe and last for over 2 centuries, and end up with the Salem witch trials. And if there's enough interest this fall, I will do a series of videos and tell you exactly what is inside this 1,000-page copy of Malleus Maleficarum, or Hammer of the Witches.
One widespread misconception about English history is that the persecution of witches was most popular in the medieval period, but this was not the case. The height of the witch craze was in the 17th century. King James wrote a book explaining the dangers of witchcraft, and Matthew Hopkins appointed himself the Witchfinder General, a role which saw the execution of over 100 witches. The Pendle witches account for 2% of all witches executed in England. When John Law suffered a stroke, he blamed Alison Device for cursing him following an incident between the pair shortly before. When questioned before a judge, Alison confessed. Not only that, she also laid accusations upon members of the Chattox family and her own grandmother, who died in a dungeon at Lancaster Castle before the trial. The condemning evidence came from a 9-year-old girl, Janet Device, who also convicted members of her own family. Though children were not usually permitted to be key witnesses, King James allowed this rule to be bent for the witch trials. Of the 10 accused, just 1, Alice Gray, was found not guilty. On the 20th of August 1612, 2 men and 7 women were hanged on charges of witchcraft.
The last witch trial in New England pursued a real woman named Winifred, who is buried here. Winifred Benham was married to Joseph Benham, a founder of Wallingford, Connecticut. The first accusation arose when he was accused of criticizing the magistrate. Goodwife Hannah Parker pointed to Winifred as a witch after Joseph threatened to shoot them for unknown reasons. Years later, teenagers accused Winnie of witchcraft, but this time they had proof. They showed bruising on their body that they claimed she inflicted. A baby died around the same time who they claimed had those bruises as well. Winnie was formally tried in Hartford with her daughter. They tied rocks to their feet to see if they could float. The women didn't drown, but they were also not condemned to death.
Have you heard of Vermont's only witch trial? In the 1700s, women were not allowed to own land. So when Mrs. Krieger's husband and son both died, she became a ward of the town. And they didn't like taking responsibility for her. When things started going awry in town, they blamed Mrs. Krieger. They called her a witch, and she was put on trial for her life. She had two options: to climb on top of a tree while men chopped it down. If God let her survive, that meant she was not a witch. Or they could cut a hole in the ice of the Hoosic River. If she floated, she was a witch. If she sunk, she was innocent. She chose option 2. They cut a hole and pushed her in, and she sunk to the bottom of the river. She was innocent, and the whole town felt guilty. But wait, is that Mrs. Krieger downriver? She was pulled to safety and lived out the rest of her life, and the cliffs above were named Krieger Rocks.
Have you ever wondered why the witches of Salem were hanged, rather than being burnt at the stake, which was a common punishment for witchcraft we're all familiar with? Well, that's because during the witch craze, most of continental Europe considered witchcraft to be the crime of heresy. And heresy was church business, meaning the witch was both tried and punished by the church. And if you were to ask a 17th century churchman, WWJD, with regard to witches, well, he'd tell you they need to be burnt alive. Whereas in England, and thereby the American colonies under British rule, witchcraft was considered sorcery, which was a civil crime, meaning the witch was tried and punished by the civil courts, and their punishment was hanging. Memento mori, memento vivere.
Elizabeth Johnson, one of the people accused of witchcraft during the Salem witch trials, has been exonerated 329 years later. Elizabeth was accused of witchcraft in 1693 like many of the other victims of the Salem witch trials, but she was not executed because the governor intervened. For those who don't know, 20 innocent people lost their lives during the witch trials, 19 were hanged, and 1 was crushed to death by rocks. All the accused witches were exonerated over the next 300 years except Elizabeth. There were outrageous tests to supposedly test if they were witches or not, but true justice was never sought until William Phips, the governor, intervened, seeing the lack of justice for these people, and that is why Elizabeth wasn't hanged. But while legislative action was taken to pardon all of the accused witches over the next 300 years, her name was never on it. Her case was re-examined by lawmakers after an 8th grade class at North Andover Middle School wanted her name to be cleared. They did research and took all the necessary steps to make sure that legislation was passed clearing Elizabeth's name once and for all. And they succeeded. The state senator said, "We will never be able to change what happened to victims like Elizabeth, but we can at least set the record straight." So next time you visit the town of Salem, I ask that you please think of Elizabeth and all the other victims of the witch trials, and that now, over 300 years later, they are officially considered innocent of witchcraft. It sure took long enough.